Hello, my name is Angelo Madsen Minax. I'm a filmmaker living in Brooklyn, New York, and this week I'll be world premiering my film North by Current at the Berlinale in the Panorama section. The film traces my relationship with my family after I returned home in the wake of my niece's death, which was unexplained. That said, the film really turns into a visual portrait or a rumination on parent-child relationships, mythologies, losses, transformations, and really becomes a sort of visual portrait of my relationship with my sister.
I can see him sitting in the chair.
Is he awake?
Uh-uh.
Passed out?
I can tell by when I'm looking at him. Because he looks different when he, you know what I mean? You know when you know somebody well enough, you know when they're like...
Yeah, you know when they're fucked up.
Yeah. Because I could see him through the window and he was just like this on the chair.
You can't be around it. You're not strong enough yet.
I'm going around seeing shit, you know? Like, obviously I can't be the
You're not the
strength
rock right
of the
now.
relationship, huh?
You're not the rock right now.
No,
And that's
yes.
okay. People take turns being rocks.
That's right.
But like...
He needs to go to he needs to go to rehab. And he would hate that. Absolutely hate that. Because his dad was always in rehab when he was growing up. What day are you leaving?
Tomorrow morning.
That's it. You told me you were going to save the extra day.
I did. Today is the extra day.
It is?
Mm-hmm.
No. Because my psychiatrist appointment is tomorrow at 2.
The extra day that I was staying was for David's arraignment this morning.
Shit. Okay, well, how about Friday?
Hi, welcome to the Teddy TV. My name is Zsombor Bobák, and this time we're going to discuss the film North by Current with director Angelo Madsen Minax. And this is my little partner in crime, Mona, who's going to also support us throughout this talk. So, hi, welcome to the Teddy TV. It's really great to have you here. Let's dive straight into it. What was the departure point for you for this highly personal story that you tell in this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious departure point for me to work on this film was definitely the death of my niece. Before her death, I would have never considered kind of making a film that investigated my own family history this way.
Right.
And the film really only became what it was through the lens of her death. So yeah, I think Kalla's death really brought out a desire to reconnect with my family, as death often does. And people who've experienced grief and loss in their lives know this time and time again. When you experience certain loss, it really compels you to want to pull your other people closer to you and reconnect with them, especially if you're in moments of disconnect with them.
Right.
Yeah, so I think the driving impetus there was really just to kind of generate some shared connectivity between myself and my biological family.
Yeah. To what extent would you say that it was a therapeutic experience to do this film for both for you and for your family?
Yeah, although I don't necessarily like the phrase therapeutic experience, ultimately it did serve to, develop better systems of communication, more empathic forms of connection. So all of the things that therapy is supposed to do, the film did help to do those things.
Yeah.
So I can't say it's not therapeutic, when it's doing all the work of that.
Right.
But I think part of my resistance to that language is that oftentimes therapy is performative more than it is authentic.
Yeah.
As a way to kind of, engage the culture of self-help and self-work. We talk about ways to therapize situations, but I think with this film, you know, in the same ways that, I don't know, we're engaging community at a more holistic level than it is an academic level, you know, like we're like, talking around everything, we're just doing the things. I think that like we set out to connect with each other differently, and that goal was achieved.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I think that was a therapeutic process.
Yeah, certainly. Nice. Transformation is something that's key to this movie, and I would say it happens on multiple levels. Can you tell us a bit about this aspect of the film?
Yeah, sure. Um, I mean, I've always been interested in like the way time moves, and I think most people interested in cinema and filmmaking and art making and critical discourse in any way are in some way, shape, or form thinking about time. Um,
Right.
and to necessitate transformation, you need time. You know, things need to take up space and time in order to change. And so I think, you know, the idea of a lifetime, a birth, a death, a middle, a beginning, an end, a transition, a sense of being in flux or being in between things is a kind of, I don't know, is like potent symbology for a film like this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got pop-ups coming on my screen.
No worries.
But yeah, I mean, I like thinking about transformation in terms of like epochs, in terms of generations, but also in terms of like hours to minutes to days. And I think that sort of contributed to the sort of non-linear approach I took to kind of playing with time throughout the course of the film. Like a lot of going back and forth between contemporary
Yes.
moments, historical moments, and historical moments from recent past, and also historical moments from much further in the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah, in that way, there is also like an interesting historiography happening throughout the film. How did you approach that?
Yeah, well, most of the archival footage is, well, all the VHS is from my childhood, and then a lot of the
Yeah.
archivals from my parents' childhoods. Um, so it was really, I mean, it was a really amazing thing to be able to have archival footage from their childhoods, because
Yeah.
most people, I don't think, have that. Um, but I mean, there's always a sort of dual narrative going at the same time, you know, which is like the story of my family, my personal experience, my weird ideas about what's happening to us. And then there's also the story of sort of like a sort of like omniscient or like above the ground kind of story of how lives unfolds, of how lives unfold over lifetimes.
Yeah.
And so I feel like using the archive really helps to bring out the universality of that, and takes the specificity away a little bit. You know, when you dig into the archive, um, there tends to be a little bit of differentiation between like the first person identification with character versus
Yeah.
the sort of like archetypal way one can identify with the archive. And I think I tend to use archive to open up that larger archetypal conversation about different ideas.
Yeah. But it's also an interesting way of reconsidering the archive, which is, generally speaking, is something that's governed by different kind of more normative power structures, and in this film it functions in a very different way. So I felt like that was also a very interesting dynamic with all the archival footage. I mean, obviously there is a lot of which is like very personal and very very private, but still I felt it also sheds a different light on the archive as a concept and on use of archival footage in film.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think oftentimes the way archival footage gets used, it's like the people that are in that archive are not being privy to that archive. You know, like
Yeah, right.
The history of archives is exclusive in some way, and like
Yeah, most
um,
certainly.
yeah. So I think kind of like taking your own archive is definitely a way to kind of I don't know, reinstate some agency into the sense of who has kind
Yeah,
of capacity and ownership in
yeah,
their own.
yeah. The film was also very much underlined with a cooperation between you and all the protagonists in the film, your whole family. It really seemed like as a very strong collaborative effort to create this film. Can you tell us about the dynamics of that?
Yeah, sure. It's so interesting because like, you know, one of the ways I can like connect best with folks is like when I'm working with something and thinking through ideas.
Yeah.
So of course, like it makes sense that for me, working with them creatively would be a really productive way to like forge those connection points. But yeah, it was, I mean, it was hard. It's hard to work with other people in general, and it's really hard to work with your family when, you know, you're also working with decades of dynamics, decades of like relational dynamics. But I think also like there was something, I mean, it was very novel to them, a lot of it. So it was super pleasurable, you know, it was fun.
Yeah.
And we have different, you know, not like value systems per se, but like, you know, the work I do operates in a different world than they are privy to. So like, I don't know, they don't bring the same level of like worry to it that I do when I'm working on it or making it. When I'm working on it, it's like very serious and I'm like trying to like do some things or whatever. And like they have a different perspective, you know, like they're able to have a lot of fun doing it. So like that was, I think like being able to see them have fun doing it and not be worried about like timetables and equipment and things that I was worried about was like actually really invigorating and calming. To have them just kind of be like, okay, well, we're ready when you're ready, was nice. You know, it was nice to have that like not preciousness, which like, I think comparatively with other filmmakers, I'm pretty not precious anyway. I sort of have like a 3-take rule. I'm like, if you don't get it in 3 times, move on with your life. But still, there was something about their collaboration that made it extra kind of feel extra embodied, extra in the moment, in the thing we were doing, as opposed to like in the projection of what the thing will be like in the future, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard, but it was really, really nice.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about the narration of the film. A big part of the film is narrated by you, but then there is this child voice that seems to fill territories maybe that you can't really access. Can you tell us about this duality and how the narration came together to the film?
Yeah. When I started writing the narration, I work a lot in essay film, and that feels like a very comfortable space for me to work in. So the film definitely comes from my tendencies to work with language and text, whether it's on screen or spoken. Anyway, but with this one, I kept like really what I would consider like waffling between tones or voices. Like I kept wanting to be subjective and open and like earnest. And like not try to hide behind intellectual language, you know? Which is a struggle for me sometimes because like in some ways I really resist the intellectualism of filmmaking, and in other ways I'm really engaged with it, and like I can't get away from the fact that I really like ideas. But at the same time, I don't want ideas to like be the only thing the film offers. Like at the end of the day, I really want a viewer to have an emotional experience. And I kept kind of having a hard time deciding whether I wanted this voiceover element to function more like more mythically or more theoretically or more subjectively. And so the idea of having the child voiceover came into my head probably through lots of other things I've seen or heard. I just can't think of them right now. So I'm like, I don't know where that idea came from. I doubt it came just from me because no idea comes just from one author. But I remember my mentor was telling me to watch, what's the name of that movie? The Richard Gere movie. I can't remember it now, but it's a movie with a great kid voiceover. But anyway, so I started really thinking about having about separating out some of the VO. And there was one point in time where I actually had 3 voiceovers. I had one that was the voice of the town as its own kind of character. And that got completely cut, of course. But yeah, the idea of trying to assign different tonal characteristics to each voice was really important to me. The child voice really took this sort of like omniscient narrator role. Like this sort of like, you know, voice of God type thing, whatever. If God was like, you know, a mythical anarchist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I could keep my own voiceover as the sort of subjective character role. So I really tried to just keep my voiceover as pared down to my character as I could.
Yeah.
And leave room for the other voice to really open up the larger questions and draw and kind of like massage out the larger threads that I'm interested in. Because those larger ideas are harder to kind of like pull out of the content without a little bit of help.
Yeah. What I found very interesting is that silence became also a very integral part of this film, and I think it was a very crucial and at the same time a very communicative tool inside of the film, if I can phrase it that way. For instance, the father's silence regarding many of the emotional aspects that the family had to go through, but at many other points of the film as well. Sometimes silence was the most telling protagonist in a way.
How are you gonna tell? How's he gonna know when to close?
Wrap it up within a few minutes.
Okay. So it's over with, guys. No mess ups.
So when you're ready for us to start, just say action so I know to start.
Action.
Are you having breakfast or are you having lunch?
I'm having breakfast.
What are you doing, Jess?
Probably lunch.
Lunch? You've never been much of a breakfast eater.
Well, where, oh, where can my baby be? The Lord took her away from me. She's gone to heaven, so I got to be good, so I can see my baby when I leave this world.
What are you having, Jesse?
Probably a sandwich.
Hamburger?
How much longer is this gonna be?
Let's get what you needed.
The car was stalled, the engine was dead. I couldn't stop, so I swerved to the right. Never forget the sound that night.
This event has happened 3 times now. Once when you just watched it. Once when I staged and filmed it. And then the first time, when 4 days after Kalla's funeral, we walked into this diner and sat down for lunch.
What can you say about this aspect?
Yeah, I think about the use of space and quiet space a lot when I'm editing. And I think for many reasons in particular, but for this film specifically, I wanted that space to sort of like mimic and echo that idea of there kind of being something missing or there being a void, to sort of like reference back the initial loss. I think, you know, it's often true of films where like you're getting just as much information from the things that are not being said as you're getting information from the things that are being said. And I think it is, it's harder sometimes to like shape things for the unsaid, but at the same time, I think it feels so much raw and sort of like real, to like experience, to bear witness to someone's experience through the things they're not telling you.
Yes.
Yeah, and then for that kind of, I don't know, I think there's an interesting way that like that, you know, gendered roles get picked up in the movie through like who's saying things and who's not saying things, but then at the same time those roles get sort of flipped on their head.
Yeah, most certainly.
Yeah, especially when like my sister is so like such a badass and so kind of like stoic,
Yeah.
that we get to sort of like rethink gender in a specifically in like a rural environment.
Yeah, definitely. What was also very intriguing to see is that the film really moves beyond traditional or more common ways of portraying trans identities and trans masculinity. So I wonder what was your aim? How did you approach this particular part of the film? Because it also felt like that you had a very deliberate idea how to portray this in the film.
Yeah. I think films from marginalized filmmakers that are not about their marginalization, you know, I think sort of like the experiences you have will be embedded in whatever you're working on. And I think that embedding of the ideas is more important than actually sort of like, I don't know, attempting to codify the experience. But yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, I tend to just in general resonate less with films that are fixated on a transition narrative. And I think that there are lots of those films available. And I think those films will probably always be important to certain people, depending on wherever someone is at in their life and their experience. But I think also, you know, there's a lot of value in putting a situation in position in all of its complexity without attempting to sort of like distill certain parts of information. And for me, the idea of like not really going very much into transition comes from a sort of like a political approach I take to a lot of my work, which is that like I don't owe an audience anything about my personal experiences, which is funny coming from someone who just made a long film about very personal experiences. But at the same time, I have a little bit of a sense of like queer refusal and resistance to want to you know be held to an audience's whim, and audiences, especially, you know, like cis, hetero, patriarchal, normative, white audience members often feel entitled to information about a protagonist, especially when it's on the screen, you know, because putting it on the screen means it's not real. It exists in another plane of existence. So you can bring all of your like terrible critiques to the table and it's not about a real person or whatever. You know, there's some semblance of differentiation between real and on screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that, you know, part of my refusal to do that is to want it to resist to give the audience what they think they're entitled to. Like they think they're entitled to a transition narrative if there's a trans character in the story. And so I think it's important to resist giving that to them.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that's a very valid and actually a very fruitful approach as well. We talked about time and the temporality of the film. Let's talk a bit about space. At some point, the narrator in the film says, if you leave a place, the place keeps on living without you, which really was one of the, I would say, one of the most important things of how you related to this town in the film. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah. You know, I think it's easy to think of that the movie starts when the character goes back to the place. Yeah. But it's also important to remember that the place has had its own whole life. Before you, after you, with you, without you. And I think, I don't know, it's easy to just start from one person's experience or your own experience. And I think I'm trying to position that clearly up front for a viewer, that like there's a whole world here before I get here that you're not being privy to. And that's a little bit of a nod that like hold this in context, of the place we are in the world, you know, the land we're on, like the era we're in, the things we've looked at before, but also like that's also like an internal kind of like note to self at the same time. Like, I'm preparing to go back to a place, and I'm acknowledging the fact that like I haven't been back in a long time, and lots of things are going to be different, and lots of things will be the same, but lots of things will be different. And when everyone like the thing about that everyone knows about growing up is that like once you leave, you can't go back. You know, when you go back, it will never be the same thing again. And I think that's kind of like a lesson we learn over and over again. But I think, you know, it's definitely a strong lesson folks learn when they have that sort of urban rural divide in their lives, which like lots of people in the US do. Lots of people like in the US kind of grow up in small towns and go to the city, you know, and it's a thing. And you're forever changed, you know, especially when you like get involved in like radical subcultures and you live a life that is like dramatically different from anything your biological family members could ever imagine. You know, it's a little bit like warping to a different universe or something.
It's good that you say that this part of the film also speaks to a lot of other people's experiences in the US, because I also felt that with the current socio-political situation in the United States, and that there was this, or there is this shift there that's taking place right now, the movie speaks a bit differently with that kind of context around it, and with this part, and in this particular time, it somehow gets a whole other layer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the film was, I finished shooting the film over the summer, but before there was a lot of racial justice mobilizing work happening in the US. And so it was sort of a weird time to finish a project that was like almost 7 years in the making. Because you can't really like attempt to put every single thing in context. It just doesn't work. So I wasn't about to like address anything remotely like pandemic related or like new justice movements or anything like that into the work, because it was the end of the film and like I had already kind of like unraveled this entire situation. But that said, I think there's something about the way the film depicts rural America that will always be conversational with whatever movements we're happening. There's a sort of like timelessness of the last like 30 or 40 years where we're in this sort of like, you know, like I feel like the United States is kind of like on its farewell tour, you know, like like good riddance now, you know, like we've ridden this like performative wave of like a land of opportunity long enough that like that's started to become more recently just how clear it is that that's not true, and that there's a lot of like performative facade around like what the country looks like outwardly that like we here know it's a bag of dicks, you know, like but that I don't know, I mean it's I feel like again talking about like the things that I had capacity to explore within the scope of the film and things that I didn't have capacity to explore but wish I had, like the politics of the environment. I mean, I could have made a whole other movie about them. Like the things that got unraveled parts of the film were just so illuminating and also sometimes like totally asinine and unbearable. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that so much.
No, I think that's like answers my question for sure. Injustice is also something that the film really tries to go around. And as I read, you also like kind of the whole impetus for this film was that you wanted to talk about injustice, and then of course a lot of other things came into this film as you were proceeding making it. Can you tell us about injustice and how it works in this film?
Yeah, sure. So when I started making the film, my family members hadn't been acquitted of anything yet, and trial was ongoing, and there was a whole matter around charges being made, still unfolding. And at that time, at the time I started filming, I thought I was making a film that was more oriented to like, I knew I always wanted to have some level of like rural masculinity be core to the piece, but I also thought that would be sort of like rural masculinity in conversation with, capitalist failings, or like the frailty of the whole idea of the prison industrial complex. And I thought that was going to be much more prevalent in the film. And then as we started filming, like I was doing all this kind of, reading, like I was doing all my Angela Davis readings and all my Foucault readings, like getting all my like panopticons together, and really thinking about how I wanted to think through the prison industrial complex in the film. And, think more expansively about like the idea of police brutality, because it's so much more visible than it's ever been before. And at the same time, there's so much kind of like microaggression that goes on in policing, especially in rural places, that isn't talked about quite as much as the types of obviously like insanely, I was going to say violence, but just fucking straight up murder that happens more obviously in urban places. And also obviously embedded in that is race and whiteness. And I wanted to like think about specifically white masculinity in rural spaces, and offer some analysis around that. But, as I started filming, the film just like became so much more personal, that it was impossible to really put all those ideas into it. And you have to like distill to be able to fit things into like an hour and a half or whatever. I think like most of the ideas people have going into a film, if they have like 5 or 6 ideas about like themes you want to hit or like different concepts you want to explore, like you're lucky if you can get like 2 or 3 out of that, because like there's just not enough space or time.
Yeah. Well, when a narrative and when a film is so personal, and it's not only your personal story, but also it involves other people's very deep personal histories, then inevitably questions of ethics and like documentary ethics come into the picture. What were your ethical considerations for making this film?
My ethical considerations were that I didn't want to do anything that that would jeopardize anyone's standing in any of the communities they operate in. So I didn't want to do anything that would, be an issue for my sister with her kids. I didn't want to do anything that would be an issue for my parents with their relationship to the church. I didn't want to like open up, like all of the conversations that happen between myself and David are very stay quite surface, because there were lots of legal agreements in place made. So I had a lot of kind of like skirting around things, which I don't think that comes through in the film much, thankfully. But you know, and there's also like several scenes that are not in the film just because I felt like they were too a little bit too raw.
Yeah.
And which is funny kind of because like I think a lot of people are turned off by this film because it is so raw, and like they have a hard time placing their own feelings in it because it's so raw. It's like just so there for you, you know. But I did actually make some pretty careful decisions about things that got shared in the scenes.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely a very emotional journey, and I would deliberately use the word journey because it feels like that this entire film, indeed, for the protagonists and as a unit, as a film, is a big journey. What do you think about this kind of reading of the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. Like, there's also a lot of visual symbolism for that. You know, like the idea of like
Yeah.
coming and going far, and just the fact that the thing unfolds over like, well, I think it's only 5 years on screen. But the idea of that sort of like unfolding and the sort of, you know, literal way that I'm coming back and forth, and the sense that like so much transformation happens within that
Yeah.
scope of time. That yeah, that I mean that does resonate with me.
Yeah. It's also very self-reflexive in many levels, this film. Was this something that you wanted to incorporate from the beginning, or was this something that kind of came organically from your working process?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. Early on, you know, I thought I was making something a little bit more critical, a little bit more analytical than quite so emotional. But I think at the same time, even when I'm working on something that is a little bit more has a little bit more of a critique bend, I'm still giving a fair amount of self in that.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of just the way, like the ways in which I'm informed by like films I really resonate with and the kinds of films I have made before. I'm usually kind of like putting together some type of larger cultural analysis in perspective with a sort of autoethnography or like personal experience of some kind. And I think really like having my own experience be part of the work is like one of the ways I feel comfortable making work about somebody else.
Yeah.
Because I'm not really, you know, no one is an authority on anyone else. And even though so much of this film is really about my relationship with my sister, you know, like I can't really speak for her. Like even if she's speaking on screen, you know, I'm still like cutting the work and presenting the work. And so to have my own voice be really kind of foundational, I think is like the most ethical approach to a work like that.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for talking to us today, and thank you also for the movie. I think it's a very moving and it's heavy, but at the same time, by the end of it, I think it's actually a very uplifting experience to go through the entire film. So for those who would feel very overwhelmed throughout the movie, I would definitely suggest to stick till the end because it is a really great experience to go through it. So thank you for sharing this very personal story with us, and yeah, I wish you all the best for the Berlinale and for the future too.
Great. Thanks so much for talking to me. It was really
Thank
lovely.
you.